When I told my son I was selling the house and moving to the Philippines, he went quiet for a long moment. Not the kind of quiet that means he's thinking. The kind that means he's trying to figure out how to tell his 67-year-old father that he's lost his mind. "Dad," he finally said, "you've never even been there." He was right. I hadn't. I'd spent my entire life within a 3-province radius of where I was born. I'd raised my kids in the same town where I grew up. I'd retired from the same company I'd joined at 22. And now here I was, sitting at the kitchen table in Guelph, Ontario, telling my son, William, that I was packing 2 suitcases and flying to a country I'd only ever seen in YouTube videos. My daughter called an hour later. She'd clearly already talked to her brother. "Papa, please just think about this a little longer," she said. "You're 67. You just lost Mom. This is not the time to be making big decisions." I understood why she said it. Her mother, my wife Janet, had passed 14 months earlier. Pancreatic cancer, quick and merciless. And I know what it looked like from the outside. A grieving widower, rattling around alone in a 4-bedroom house, watching videos on his laptop at 2 in the morning, convincing himself that moving halfway across the world was somehow a solution. But here's what they didn't understand. This wasn't grief talking. This was math. Not the emotional kind, the actual kind. Numbers on a spreadsheet that I'd been staring at for the better part of a year, adding and subtracting, running the same calculations over and over, hoping they'd eventually come out differently. They never did. After Janet passed, I had her pension survivor benefit plus my own CPP. Between the two, I was bringing in just under $3,000 a month. In most parts of the world, that's a reasonable income for a retired person. In Guelph, in 2024, it was barely enough to keep the lights on. Property taxes on the house had gone up again. The furnace had needed replacing the previous winter. My car insurance had increased for the 3rd year in a row, even though I'd had no claims and was driving maybe 4,000 kilometers a year. Groceries. I don't even need to explain groceries to anyone in Canada right now. You already know. I wasn't in crisis. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't about to lose the house. I wasn't going hungry. But I was watching my small savings account drain at a pace that scared me. Not because I was being reckless, because I was being ordinary. A normal retired person, living a normal quiet life, and still the money kept going out faster than I was comfortable with. There's a particular kind of stress that comes with that situation. I think it's different from the stress you feel when something goes wrong. When something goes wrong, you deal with it. You fix it or you don't, and then it's behind you. But the slow financial squeeze of retirement isn't like that. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there, quietly, every single day. Every grocery receipt, every heating bill, every time you skip something small because you're mentally adding up numbers without even realizing you're doing it. Janet and I used to talk about retirement like it was going to be this open stretch of time. Travel, slow mornings, no alarms. We'd earned it. We'd worked for it. But the retirement I was actually living felt less like an open stretch and more like a tightening corridor, and I was walking it alone. One evening in January, I was sitting at the kitchen table doing what had become a kind of ritual, going through the monthly expenses with a mug of tea that had gone cold. Nothing unusual. No emergency. Just the regular numbers doing their regular thing, and I remember sitting back in the chair and thinking, very clearly and without drama, is this it? Is this what the rest of it looks like? That question didn't go away. I started researching. At first, I didn't have a destination in mind. I was just reading about Canadians who had retired abroad. Some had gone to Portugal, some to Mexico, some to Costa Rica, and then I kept coming across the Philippines over and over. Retired Canadians and Americans writing about how far their pensions stretched, about the weather, about the people, about something that was harder to put into words, a kind of ease they said they'd stopped expecting to feel. At first I thought that was just expat romanticizing, people who'd made a dramatic decision and needed to justify it. But the more I read, the more one detail kept catching my attention. They weren't talking about getting rich. They weren't talking about luxury. They were talking about feeling less stressed, about sleeping better, about the particular relief of not waking up every morning already calculating. I'd forgotten what that felt like. So I booked a flight, one way, and I flew to Cebu City with 2 suitcases, a pension, and absolutely no idea what I was doing. The first thing I learned, and I learned it before I'd even unpacked, is that the biggest risk isn't always the change. Sometimes it's the staying. I had spent months coming up with reasons not to go. I was too old. It was too far. I didn't know anyone. What if I got sick? What if I hated it? What if my kids needed me? What if I couldn't adapt? And those reasons were real. They weren't excuses. But what I hadn't been asking myself, with the same seriousness, was what the risk of staying actually looked like. Another winter in a house that felt enormous and empty. Another year watching the savings account shrink. Another stretch of months where nothing was wrong, exactly, but nothing felt right either. When I finally flipped the question, when I stopped asking whether leaving was risky, and started asking whether staying was, the answer came quickly. I arrived in Cebu in early March. The heat was the first thing. I stepped out of the airport and it hit me like opening an oven door, and I thought, well, this is either going to kill me or I'm going to love it. Within about a week, I loved it. But the city itself took longer to understand. I'd rented a small apartment in a residential neighborhood not far from the university district. 2 bedrooms, a little balcony, a kitchen with a gas stove, and a small electric fan over the counter. 8,000 pesos a month, which works out to about 200 Canadian dollars. I'd been paying more than that for my car insurance alone. The first few weeks, I was still operating with a Canadian mind in a Filipino body. I was still doing the mental math constantly. I was still waking up early and lying there with the familiar hum of low-grade worry. Nothing dramatic, just the habit of it. Decades of conditioning don't dissolve in a week. And then, about 6 weeks in, something shifted. I can tell you exactly where I was. I was sitting outside a small sari-sari store at the end of my street, on a white plastic chair that had seen better decades. It was late afternoon. A group of kids were playing basketball on the court across the street. A real court, proper hoops, but no net, which seemed to bother no one. My neighbor, a man named Bong, who runs a small barber shop from the front room of his house, was sitting nearby eating a mango he'd peeled with a knife in about 4 movements. 2 women from down the street were talking near the gate of the house beside the store. Somewhere close by, someone was frying garlic. That smell. If you've spent any time in the Philippines, you know that smell. It gets into everything and you stop minding immediately. I was sitting there, watching all of this, and I realized that my mind was quiet. Not empty, not numb, just quiet. I wasn't planning ahead, I wasn't calculating, I wasn't worried about next month or next year or what Janet would have thought or whether I'd made a mistake. I was just sitting there, watching a man eat a mango and some kids play basketball, and I was completely present in a way I hadn't been in years. That sounds small. I know it sounds small. But after months of that low-level hum in the background of everything, the quiet felt enormous. That was when I understood what all those expats had been trying to describe. They weren't talking about money, or not only about money. They were talking about what happens to your nervous system when the financial pressure drops below a certain threshold. When you stop white-knuckling through every month. When the numbers actually work and you stop holding your breath, waiting for the thing that's going to break them. My cost of living in Cebu settled around 65,000 pesos a month, roughly 1,600 Canadian dollars. That covered rent, groceries, a small amount of eating out, my phone plan, transportation, and a reasonable cushion for unexpected expenses. On my pension income, I was not only covering everything, I had room to breathe, actual room. Money sitting in the account at the end of the month that I hadn't spent, not because I was being miserly, but because I simply hadn't needed to spend it. For the first time in years, I felt financially stable, and what surprised me was how much that changed everything else. I started sleeping better almost immediately after the money stress lifted. I'd assumed I was a light sleeper by nature. I'd been a light sleeper since Janet got sick. Turns out I'd just been carrying too much to sleep properly. I started noticing things. Little things. The way the light comes through the trees in the morning before the heat builds. The sound of the street vendors calling out. The tindera with her cart of bread rolls at 6:30. The man with the balut cart at dusk. The Tahoe vendor early on weekend mornings. I started looking forward to these things. That was new. Looking forward to small things. I joined a small group of retired expats who met for coffee on Thursday mornings at a cafe near the park. There were maybe 8 or 10 regulars. A man named Glenn from Saskatchewan. A woman named Diane from Vancouver Island who'd moved to Cebu after her own husband passed and had been there almost 4 years. A quiet retired teacher from Edinburgh named Callum who'd ended up in the Philippines through a series of events he described as one sensible decision leading to a completely unexpected life. These were people who understood what I was going through without needing it explained. Something I hadn't expected was how much I would value the community here. Not just the expat community, the Filipino community. My neighbors, Bong from the barbershop, the woman who runs the laundry place 2 doors down, whose name is Maritz, and who speaks excellent English and has a very strong opinion about how long jeans should be soaked before washing them. The family across the street who started inviting me to their Sunday lunches about a month after I arrived, without any particular reason offered except that there was food and I was welcome. In Canada, I had lived in my neighborhood for 11 years and I could name maybe 4 of my neighbors. Here, within 2 months, I knew the names of most of the people on my street. That's not a criticism of Canada. It's just a different way of organizing community. And I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it until I found myself in the middle of it again. The loneliness I'd been carrying since Janet died didn't vanish. That's not how grief works. But it changed shape. It became something I was carrying in the company of other people, rather than something I was carrying alone in a quiet house. That was unexpected, and it mattered more than I can easily explain. One of the things I'd worried about before leaving was healthcare. This is the big Canadian worry. We grow up with the understanding that universal healthcare is part of the social contract, part of what it means to be Canadian, and the idea of leaving that system behind, especially at 67, especially after watching a spouse go through serious illness, felt genuinely frightening. Here's what I found. I got international health insurance through a Canadian provider before I left. It costs me about $240 a month Canadian, which feels like a lot until you do the comparison. My first visit to a private clinic in Cebu, blood work, a consultation with a physician, a prescription, cost the equivalent of about 35 Canadian dollars out of pocket after the clinic's own subsidy. I had a dental checkup and a cleaning done for under $20. I'm not saying the Philippine healthcare system is the same as Canada's. It's not. But the private clinics in Cebu City are clean, well-staffed, and the doctors I've seen have been thorough and unhurried. For routine care, I have not felt poorly served. My son visited in October, about 7 months after I arrived. I had been nervous about the visit in a way I hadn't quite admitted to myself. I wanted him to understand what I'd found here. I didn't want him to spend the whole week quietly confirming whatever worried narrative he'd been carrying since I left. He arrived looking uncertain. By the 3rd day, he was eating longanisa for breakfast without asking what it was, and agreeing that the mango situation in Canada is a national embarrassment. On the last evening, we went for a walk along the waterfront, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "You seem like yourself again, Dad. Like the version of you from before." I didn't say anything for a moment. He meant before Janet got sick, I think, or maybe before the years of quiet strain. Either way, he wasn't wrong. What I've come to understand about stress is that it's not always something you feel dramatically. The stress I'd been living with for years had become invisible to me, because I'd been inside it for so long. It was the water I was swimming in. I didn't know how heavy it was until I wasn't carrying it anymore. The Philippines didn't remove stress from my life. That would be ridiculous. There are frustrations here. The traffic in Cebu is genuinely impressive in its chaos. Bureaucratic processes move at their own pace, which is not always a fast one. Power goes out occasionally. My Cebuano is improving but slowly, and there are moments when I'm clearly the person in the room who understands the least. But these are surface frustrations. They don't have weight in the way the old stress had weight. They don't follow me to bed. I'd been confusing comfort with happiness for most of my adult life. I realize that now. In Canada, I had comfort, a paid-off house, a familiar city, routines I could walk through half asleep, healthcare I trusted, a language that was mine, family nearby. Comfort is not nothing. Comfort is genuinely valuable, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. But somewhere along the way I'd started treating comfort and happiness as though they were the same thing. As though if I was comfortable, I should be content. And when I wasn't content, when the tightening corridor feeling crept back in, I didn't know what to do with that, because all the boxes seemed to be checked. Here, the boxes I used to check don't entirely apply. I don't have the familiar. I don't have the automatic. Everything requires a little more attention, a little more intention. And what I found, to my genuine surprise, is that living with more intention makes me feel more alive. Not in a dramatic way. Just in the everyday sense of noticing what I'm doing and choosing to do it rather than sliding through the day on autopilot. I've started writing again. Nothing serious. A journal, mostly. Notes about what I see, what I eat, what I think about on the walks I take every morning before the heat builds. I used to write when I was young, before work and family, and the ordinary machinery of adult life took over. I hadn't written anything in probably 30 years. Here, I started again, almost without deciding to. I just found myself picking up a notebook one morning and not being able to put it down. My daughter came to visit in December, for Christmas. She brought her 2 kids, my grandchildren, who are 9 and 12, and who approached the whole adventure with the magnificent adaptability that children have and adults seem to slowly lose. Within about 48 hours, they had made friends with the kids from the family across the street and were attempting to play basketball with them in the courtyard. My daughter watched this from the balcony one afternoon, and then she looked at me and said, "I get it now." That was enough. What I've learned about family, and specifically about what it means to be a father and grandfather from a distance, is more complicated than I expected. I miss them. That's simple and true, and it doesn't need elaboration. I miss being able to drop in on William's family for dinner. I miss being 5 minutes away when something goes wrong. Video calls are wonderful, and they are also a reminder of what they're substituting for. But I've also learned something I didn't expect. That the quality of my presence when I'm actually with them has improved, because I'm no longer taking it for granted. When William visited, we had 7 days together, and I was fully there for every one of them. No distractions, no half-presence. When my daughter and the grandchildren were here at Christmas, I was more intentional about every meal, every outing, every evening on the balcony. The distance has made me a better version of available when I am available. I can afford to go back to Canada once a year. That's something I'd mapped out before I left, and it's held true. I'll be there in June for about 3 weeks. See the family, visit Janet's grave, check in with my doctor, see a few old friends. That visit costs money, but it's money I now have because everything else costs so much less. This is the part where I want to be honest, because I think too many of these stories end too neatly. The Philippines is not paradise. No place is. There are days here when I'm lonely in a way that has nothing to do with being surrounded by people. There are days when I miss the particular gray comfort of a Canadian October afternoon, which I know sounds strange but is real. There are days when I miss Janet so acutely that the beauty of where I am makes it worse instead of better, because she would have loved this, and she's not here to see it. Those days exist. I'm not going to pretend they don't. But those days also exist when you stay. They're not unique to leaving. Grief follows you wherever you go because it's not a place, it's a you. What I found here is not an escape from any of that. What I found is a life that makes it easier to keep going. A life where the practical weight is lighter, which means I have more capacity to carry the emotional weight. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. I've been here just over a year now. I pay less than $900 a month for everything, including rent, food, utilities, and a reasonable buffer. I sleep 8 hours most nights. I walk every morning. I have neighbors who know my name. I have a Thursday coffee group where nobody asks me how I'm coping. I have a grandchild who video calls me to show me things she's found in the garden, as though I'm just in the other room. I have mornings where I sit on the balcony with a coffee and watch the neighborhood come to life and feel, without having to manufacture it, genuinely glad to be here. The thing I've learned, the one that took the longest and surprised me the most, is that I was thinking about retirement wrong for most of my life. I thought it was an arrival. I thought it was the point where the work ended and the reward began. I thought it was, in some important way, the finish line. And for years I measured how well retirement was going by how close to that imagined finish line I was, how much I'd saved, how few problems I had, how comfortable things were. But sitting on a balcony in Cebu City at 68 years old, I finally understood something I hadn't before. Retirement isn't the end of anything. It's just another stretch of the journey, another chapter. And like any chapter, it can be written in a lot of different ways. I had let myself believe that at a certain age, the story more or less writes itself. That the shape of your life gets determined and the rest is just living it out. Coming here, doing this completely unreasonable thing that my children were so worried about, proved that wrong in the best possible way. I'm still writing the story. That's what I didn't know I needed to understand. And if you're sitting somewhere right now, going through the same monthly calculations I was doing, feeling that same quiet tightening that you can't quite put your finger on, I just want to say this. The discomfort you feel might not be a problem to solve. It might be a signal. It might be the story trying to move forward. I'm glad I listened to it.